Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about logical fallacies. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of logical fallacies, so it's kind of hard to talk about it in broad brushstrokes terms and have it really be meaningful, which is why this is the opening to a logical fallacies series here on the Writing Notes channel. In this video, I'm going to talk about sort of generally what a logical fallacy is, what the problems with them are, this kind of thing, give you the sort of overview. But then I'm going to have a series of videos where I talk about some of the major types of logical fallacies, things like a straw man fallacy, the hasty generalization, the either-or fallacy, these kinds of things. So, to start out at the most basic level, what is a logical fallacy? Well, a logical fallacy is a form of reasoning that breaks down in some way. It is unsound reasoning. To make that a little bit clearer, basically, a logical fallacy is an argument structure. You are making an argument, you are presenting information or evidence or interpretation in a particular way, and that way may look like a logically reliable argument, but it's not. There's some kind of failure in the way that you are presenting that evidence. What exactly that looks like depends on the particular logical fallacy. Again, so this is part of the reason it's difficult to talk in the broad brushstrokes. But I'll give you an example. For instance, if we think about a hasty generalization fallacy, short version, this is where you take a small number of data points and you extrapolate to make a generalization about a large group. And that generalization may or may not be accurate. This is actually one of the tricky things about a logical fallacy, is that the argument itself can be correct, but a logical fallacy, because it's a breakdown of reasoning, actually can't be a functional argument in favor of that position. So even if the conclusion you're drawing is true, the structure of the argument that you use to prove that argument or support that argument is still going to be unreliable. So you have that problem. It's not a truth value. A logical fallacy isn't a truth assessment, right? Something can be true without being logically sound, or something can be logically sound without necessarily being true if some of the premises are invalid, whatever it is. So there's that element of it. But basically, so the point that I'm really trying to illustrate here, with something like a hasty generalization, you're drawing a conclusion without sufficient evidence, and so the conclusion can't be considered reliable. And this is the way that logical fallacies work. In some way, the conclusion is going to be unreliable because of problems with the structure of the argument, the way that the argument is developed, interpreted, the way that evidence is understood, etc., etc. Particularly bearing in mind that logical fallacies are not inherently a marker of untrue arguments, that an argument can be true without, even if the argument itself is made with logical fallacies. What's the use of these ideas? Well, there's twofold. Two major reasons to be aware of logical fallacies. One is to avoid using them in your own writing, right? If you want to persuade people that the arguments you're making are correct, avoiding logical fallacies is really, really important, right? Because if the argument structure, the movement from information to conclusions is not reliable, then you're less likely to persuade people. They're not going to believe you if the argument doesn't merit being believed. That's one major component. The other major component is that this makes you a more careful, critical reader. If you can read an argument and say, I recognize that. That's the no true Scotsman fallacy, or the appeal to false authority, or whatever it is, fallacy, whichever one it happens to be, then you can say, okay, so that argument is not reliable. Now I need to think more critically and more carefully about whether or not to believe this argument, about whether or not the source of this argument is trustworthy, the person who's telling me this, whether I should believe other things that they're saying, or whether I should be more careful, more critical about other things that they're saying, right? So again, you don't want to leap to the conclusion that because an argument has a logical fallacy in it, it must therefore be untrue. But you do want to be much more cautious about believing it to be true if the only argument you are being given is built on a logical fallacy.